early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.
It's great to know you joined us on Early Exchange this beautiful Friday morning. Yes, thank God it's Friday, but not just being about Friday, there are issues we need to talk about. And one of them is the metering gap in Nigeria. Lots of electricity consumers are not metered in Nigeria, and that comes with the consequence of estimated billing, which sometimes creates trouble for the distribution companies and the electricity consumers, because it's a reason for conflict as to, oh, if I consume this much on the side of the consumer, and then the electricity distribution companies would say it's an estimation of the electricity consumed in that particular area. But what is the solution to this? It is providing meters, which the Presidential Metering Initiative intends to achieve. Now, for that purpose, the federal government has made some deductions towards the funding of this. So, in the month of June, revenue that was recorded by the federal government from that 100 billion naira was deducted as second tranche of the Presidential Metering Initiative funding. Let's look at what this Presidential Metering Initiative will help for the consumers and also the distribution companies. Joining us on the conversation virtually this morning, we'll have Orji Chigozie Udumezue, who is a business analyst and the managing consultant, CEO of Flame Academy Consulting Limited. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Blessing. Blessing, can you hear me?
Thank you for joining. Now, looking at the issue of metering in Nigeria, like I said in the opening, it's been a cause for conflict between consumers and distribution companies when it's time to pay up. But the metering gap itself, there have been several initiatives to try to close it. Once there was the map, and then now there is the Presidential Metering Initiative. The second tranche for that has been, the funding for that has been provided by deduction of 100 billion naira from May revenue by the federal government. What's your assessment of this initiative? What are the benefits of it for the distribution companies and then the consumers?
All right. I think the initiative has good intentions behind it. The campaign of the president promised that they will take very strong actions to ensure that the electricity sector of Nigeria is revolutionized and almost all Nigerians are properly metered and charged for the quantity of energy or power that they consume to ensure efficiency and to drive revenue in that sector. So the initiative, that's the Presidential Metering Initiative, I think is in line with that promise, that campaign promise. However, many stakeholders have positioned that the process is not very well aligned with the Constitution, that the engagement of stakeholders was not properly done to ensure that everybody is on the same page, that important agreements or memoranda of understanding were not done amongst the SOUQ, the Federal Allocation Committee stakeholders. So it's alleged that government is doing that on their own, so much so when the players in the sector are private entities. So the argument is, why would you deduct our money? The different state commissioners of finance who are members of the SOUQ are asking, why would they have to suffer to be able to satisfy the private sector, who ought to find ways to resolve their issues in terms of revenue mobilization, in the energy sector. But all that having been said, the important thing is, there's need for accountability and, transparency in the process. Even though the process itself or the policy itself is intended to solve Nigeria's most important or most crucial, problem, which is the energy problem, in the economy. So I believe that federal government should step back a bit and ensure that all stakeholders are well engaged as they carry out this, because this deduction is not the only one that's going to happen. I think there have been a deduction before then, and there may be several more deductions throughout the year, as I understand that the initiative is targeted at mobilizing about 700 billion naira from the federal allocation committee, funds. That is the fund from where states, local government, and the federal government, get revenue from the, from the nation's revenue sources. So the policy in itself is a very good one, but I'm concerned that government has to do it with the total carrying along or consent or commitment or understanding of all the stakeholders.
All right, glad to have you join us once again. Now talking about the concerns as regards deduction from the Federation account to fund this initiative. You're aware in April, some of 120 billion was also deducted. And if you add that to the latest deduction, which is about 100 billion, so far it's looking like 220 billion has been earmarked for this initiative. But if you look at the results, if you look at the statistics of number of Nigerians who are yet to be metered, according to statistics provided by the regulatory authority, of about 13 million people who are registered or registered power users in Nigeria connected to the national grid, you still have a shortfall of about 7 million. What do you think is the missing link here? Despite the funds being devoted to this initiative, you still have this deficit. What actually is the missing link here?
Well, the initiative is just starting. The required effort or activities to ensure that these meters are purchased and distributed, even if it's for free, that has not started yet. If you do a budget to carry out an activity, you have to raise the money. So what I think the federal government is doing now is to raise the budget to position for this policy, which they had said they wanted to see through within this fiscal year 2024. So I assume that what they are doing is to ramp up the deductions so that before the end of the year, the government should have gathered enough funds to pull through this policy. So the impact of the policy is not expected to be seen yet. In fact, the reverse seems to be the case right now, where quarter on quarter is been reported that the number of people who are actually unmetered, is increasing instead of coming down. Even though I know that it's been argued that it is more efficient, it's more beneficial for consumers to go metered, to buy the meter. People are trying, even in my hometown, my family has had to make effort, in the village to get, the meter. In Lagos already, we have used the meter, prepaid meter for several years already. And even though, unfortunately, many people in Lagos, in a city like Lagos or even Abuja, are still going on estimated billing, which is totally unacceptable. So the point is, the idea of the policy is to ramp up or to increase the number of people who are metered in their electricity consumption. The metering is expected to ensure that people pay for what they consume. They don't pay much more than what they consume or much less than what they consume. So that there will be an efficient allocation of that energy resource. And of course, appropriate or commensurate payment for it so that the distribution companies, who are, by the way, private entities, can begin to see their revenue and be able to meet their investment requirements in that business, such that we can see electricity distribution expand in Nigeria. Even though not much has been talked about generation of this electricity, because in trying to improve electricity supply in Nigeria, you must talk about generation, transmission, and of course distribution. But if we get the pricing right, because in the distribution chain, which is very critical, because that's where the revenue from that sector comes in. If we get it right, then it is it becomes very crucial or a good incentive for generation to be also ramped up. Because if there's a demand, a profitable demand for what to generate, then obviously suppliers, or generators who want to generate much more and get good value for it. So the whole policy is to enhance efficiency in distribution and ensure that people pay for what they consume. But in Nigeria, the story is, quite, neither here nor there. While you would think that people would pursue metering, to ensure that they pay for what they actually consume, you find that some games are going on. Some people who have their way, either in the distribution companies or in some, technology initiative or the other, actually deliberately still go unmetered. In fact, I even hear that even those who have had the prepaid meter are dropping it and going back to the, estimated billing system for whatever gain they get from it. Some people find their way to bypass the estimation or underestimate their bills or collude with the discos to ensure they always pay much, much less than they consume. So that seems to be the thing, ramping up the number of people that are still in the estimation stage. While some families are also crying that in estimation, they pay much more than they consume because they don't have power supply throughout the whole month, and they yet get some horrible estimated bill. So it's neither here nor there. There is so much opacity, lack of transparency, in fact, outright fraud and corruption going on in this sector. So I believe that this policy is geared, if it's successful, towards eliminating all of this confusion, so that people will actually, pay for what they consume. And if what they pay is very hurting or expensive, they can, or we as a country can now begin to look at what other affordable or cheap alternative energy, particularly, renewable energy sources or less destructive energy sources that we can provide for them. That is, green energy sources like solar and so on, but we haven't tapped into that at all in this country. How can we, for those who are not in the national grid, how can we use some initiatives like you have in some countries like Rwanda? Some companies are busy trying to see how poor families can be connected to, a grid of solar power supply. That can also be extended to Nigeria, and it can be very lucrative in supporting the main power supply system that we have today in Nigeria.
All right. According to the managing director of the Abuja Distribution Electricity Company, he says that this initiative would unlock about 1 trillion naira tied up in the Nigerian electricity supply industry. Now, but from what you have narrated, the account of how some persons have paid for meters but are yet to get them and still on estimated billion, while those who have meters try to go back to estimated billing. It seems there's much that more than what meets the eye about the metering gap in Nigeria. If this initiative is geared towards raising revenue from the electricity distribution industry, yet we'll find that access to the meters are challenging even for those who are paid. Now, how do you think it would be? Because this initiative is to provide meters to the end-use consumers at zero cost.
And that's one major issue Nigeria has always had to deal with. Issues around corruption, issues around non or improper governance, where a nation says this is the way we want to go, or this is the objective of a particular process or a particular course of action. And you find state actors, people whose duties include managing the process. You find them thwarting. You find them defrauding. You find them mismanaging the process. How can people pay for meter an amount you've told them to pay, that's the cost of the meter, and they pay, they are not able to get them? What's going on between their payment and delivery of those facilities? So you can imagine, Blessing, that even now government is trying to pool money from different states and in fact, different levels of government to buy these meters to make them free. Trust me, here and now, we can agree that people will eventually not get these meters free. People will have to pay some kind of corrupt money to be able to actually get this meter. So who is fooling who? So that's where we require ethical and righteous government to drive policies. If people at the local government level or state level or institutional level feel that the government itself at the center is corrupt, and I'm not trying to adduce that here, but I'm saying if people feel that things are not done righteously, then whatever process they have to manage on their own, they also try to corrupt the system in that same way. So we need an ethical government. We need a government that will be sincere in ensuring that righteousness starts from their level all the way down, such that if you get one person alone who is defrauding a process, you sack him and he becomes a scapegoat. And you ensure the people that you give mandate, whether they are commissioners or directors or state governors or ministers of government, at different levels, that people that you give this, take it seriously, just like in the
All right. It's quite unfortunate that the internet couldn't permit him to wrap up his thoughts on that. But the reality is, these prepaid meters are supposed to be free, as regards the initiative being made by the federal government. But the reality is people pay for it. I remember the last time I was privileged to do that, I had to pay about 100,000 naira or more. And you expected to even pay those guys who are going to even fix
install the
meters. And I
meters.
even learned presently now, those meters are not available. So what you do is, with the few ones that are available, if you can pay more, then you get it. It has got into that situation. And that's why it's important for the federal government to revisit it. So the question people are asking is if monies are being devoted to these with the motive for getting it free to the end users, and then it's not being achieved, that it raises some questions. But let's get back to our guest, Alan. He's back with us. Glad to know you're still there with us. Glad to have you back, Orji, if you can hear me.
I had some network concerns. So the point I'm making is that the most important thing we need in this country is discipline at every level of governance. And we need that to be driven by, the top leaders. We always talk about leadership and followership being the major issues. But I believe that if we can get a stroke of quality, authentic, and righteous leadership from the federal level, everybody will fall in line. Because leadership must be exemplary. If your body language or the things that you do, the way you deploy people, the way you allow them do their work, they don't appear upright to the people, then everybody follows suit in whatever level of activity they manage. So we need the APC government to show good example in whatever they do and ensure that they drive down discipline and responsibility, in every level and get people punished for bad behavior. When people do bad things and get away with it, you create anarchy and chaos in the society. So in this energy issue, to minimize wastages, corruption, and unwholesome practices, we must ensure that the discos are given strict guidelines that they must follow for them to benefit from this policy, because it's more like trying to subsidize the energy sector. If you release this money to the discos to get the meters, you must follow through and collect feedback. One thing we don't do in Nigeria is quality survey that will enable government to understand how policies impact people and how they are implemented. So we can focus a lot more on evidence-based policy making. So if we can find a way to track performance of this policy and activity, then it's a very good policy, because at the end of the day, the 1 trillion they want to unlock will appear in the sense that when people now get the meter, even though they get it free, the resultant effect to the economy is that people can no longer consume the very much needed electricity without paying for it. Those who can afford it will pay and get it and use it profitably to run their businesses, whether it's a hotel or a school or a hospital or their personal affairs, they pay and they get it. And by the way, when they get it and they pay for it, you find that they actually reduce their cost of petrol consumption, diesel consumption. So the multiplier effect of the economy will be very huge. So beyond unlocking 1 trillion naira of revenue that people don't, that the discos don't get today, there are several other multiplier effects. The productive capacity of the economy will more than quadruple, will expand, because the plumber, the electrical man, the shopkeeper, supermarkets who need to refrigerate their stock and so on, will all begin to do business at their optimal level. And you can find the economies, the GDP, growing in leaps and bounds. So the benefits are huge, but can we be ethical and disciplined enough to pull through the policy in a very righteous manner?
All right, now let's get back to the criticism against the federal government, which is for deducting from the Federation account to fund this initiative. One would expect that maybe a private arrangement could have been made for a sector that has been privatized. What should be the role of government here? And don't you think that the criticism is justified with the fact that that sector is privatized?
Well, I mentioned that earlier in my first comment, Femi. I mentioned that there are controversies facing government decision, and those controversies are right in their own, intentions. We run a democratic government, a constitutional democracy, by the way. So you expect that even though you are the commander-in-chief or the president, you are not running an autocratic system or a despotic system where you can wake up or to the constitution, even though you are driving towards a good objective. That's why in politics, talk about lobbying, collective engagement. So what I had expected from this government, even though they're in a hurry to do something good, but whatever that's worth doing is worth doing well. I expected that the government, before they started the deductions, they must engage all the stakeholders. The Federal Accounts Allocation Committee, that the fact stakeholders must be engaged. Even if it might take a long time to change the constitution to allow them to do that deduction, they can do an MOU with them. Because laws are meant for people and not people for the laws. But for the federal government to wake up on their own and begin to deduct, the commonwealth of the nation to achieve their own well-intended, in quote, objective, it calls for questions. And in a very, proper democracy, the government has exposed itself to proper legal actions or litigations against their process. And that could actually scuttle the whole process in itself. That's why governance is important in everything that we do. You want to do something good, go ahead, but do it in a good way too. You can't follow a bad process to do something good. Otherwise, you might be suspected of some ulterior motives. Thank you.
All right. While we cannot determine whether there are ulterior motive or not, let's look at the aim of providing these meters for consumers and the challenges with availability of the meters. So money is being set aside to fund provision of meters, but as we're saying, the availability of the meters are not sufficient to reach the cost consumers that need these meters. What are some of the challenges with having meters available for even those paying and those that will be given free, because it's not going to be free exactly. The federal government will be paying for them. Does it have anything with the production of the meters themselves? Does it have anything to do with logistics? What are the issues?
Like I mentioned before, the production of meters may not be a problem. I believe that from wherever country we get the meters, we can reach an agreement with the manufacturing companies to produce enough for Nigeria. That's after government has put the funds together. The challenge before now might have been poor coordination or management by discos in trying to get these meters, applied for imported, cleared, and brought into the country. The process has not been smooth over the years. Okay, assuming that we take that as a major constraint. But beyond that, like I said earlier, you find some collusions going on, some deliberate activities of the discos not to supply these meters, even though people have paid for them, either because they believe they make much more money by charging people whatever they wake up and decide to charge you. And beyond that too, the operators, the runners of these discos might actually be making money on their own individually in their private pockets by collecting bribes, colluding with their consumers to twist their metering systems or estimating bills for them in a favorable way, and then sharing the proceeds from that favor that they do the customers. So it's a whole lot of issues. I don't want to come here and accuse anybody, personally, but I see this happen even at the micro level. The discos are not also, doing themselves, good favor. They are meant to be private institutions which must be run in a very effective manner. But they still carry about the activity as if they are more like public institutions where nobody cares about profitability and so on. So I charge the discos, the real private owners of these companies, if they are truly private, to ensure that their businesses are done in a profitable manner. People are given targets, monitored based on those targets, and then relieved of their duties when they don't perform. Otherwise, you will see the same corruption going on, where even though providing meters will enable them to make more revenue, but people sabotage that effort because they make private money from the whole racketing going on. That's a big challenge. And that's why I said it requires ethical and, righteous management and leadership for this to happen. People must be caught for doing what is wrong and punished for it. So that if we want to get these meters, we can pay for them, get them manufactured, and we follow through until they get into the hands of the consumers. Otherwise, despite raising billions of naira to pay for these meters, like I said earlier, it will not get to people, or it will still get to them following some bureaucratic and corrupt procedures, which will, by the way, damage the process again and make the whole thing, not effective at the end.
What about private business, the distribution companies running private business, yet the government is kind of subsidizing meters that aid their business. Now, if the government is providing meters for the distribution companies, what do you think the government can do as a way of supporting the transmission companies and even the generation companies, particularly the transmission companies? Because one of the challenges with the power sector that we found in as the years go by is that the infrastructure that they have, some of them are obsolete, and so it also results to energy loss along the line of transmission. What would you advise in that regard?
Ideally, in a classical economic thoughts, governments are not supposed to interfere in private enterprises, set prices, provide subsidies, and so on. But following the neoclassical economic thinking, championed by the great economist, the Lord John Maynard Keynes, that due to some rigidities in the market, due to some influences in the market, that government needs to, once in a while, play their hand to direct the economy in the way of growth, inclusive growth and development. And therefore, it becomes right sometimes for government to prioritize some sectors and decide where they think that government can use taxpayers' money to rescue a particularly important or critical sector at one time or the other. And this is why government will use taxpayers' money to buy over bad loans from the banks in Nigeria, based on the fact that the financial sector is strongly connected to the economy, and their failure might lead to the failure of the whole economy, even though it gives rise to moral hazard and tends to encourage bad behavior by the players in that sector. But government looks at different sectors and attach some level of criticality or importance, to those sectors. So as it is done in the financial sector, government seems to think now that even in the energy sector, that there's need to support them with taxpayers' money to be able to revamp that sector, knowing that the sector is very, very critical to the growth of this economy if you want to ramp up very good growth. So on that basis, you can say that government is prioritizing this sector and therefore committing taxpayers' money to subsidize the activities, though they are privately run. But in doing that too, to minimize the effect of moral hazard, those monies should not be given carelessly. Those meters should not be bought and given out carelessly, without ensuring that the purpose is met. So why government is doing this is that the energy sector, to them, will help them drive great economic growth that will provide jobs, which will tend to reduce insecurity and so on, which are the sole duties or responsibilities of government. So anything government is doing for the private sector, they are doing it with the ultimate intention to improve economic growth, minimize unemployment, generate more productivity and activity in the economy, and possibly even export power and make foreign exchange, to achieve those major macroeconomic objectives of nations. So they are doing it here because that sector has become critical for Nigeria to unlock its potentials and move to a level of significant economic growth. So in that sense, you can justify this government activity. But then, like I said earlier, they must engage properly at all levels. Engage the whole nation to see what they're trying to do. Engage the whole states and local government to see the need to take part of their money, part of their monthly allocations to invest in this sector, knowing that when the sector is working very well, businesses and activities in every level of government, local government, state government, will be impacted. So federal government is using their power to do something that will benefit the whole economy. But then they must do it righteously, constitutionally, and judiciously. Thank you.
All right, now let's address issues around local production of these meters. According to the target set by the Presidential Metering Initiative, is to ensure that they produce about 7 million meters to cover up for the deficit in the next 3 to 4 years, which means to achieve that, they have to produce nothing less than 2 million liters annually. But do you think Nigeria has the capacity to produce these meters locally or meet up with this target? And what can be done to attract the right investment towards local production of these meters?
For me, it does not matter whether the meters are produced locally or internationally. What's important is to look at the efficiency or the effectiveness also of whatever options that you make. If it will cost you 1,000 naira, for example, to produce a local meter in Nigeria, but it will cost you 700 naira to produce, import, and land a foreign meter, which is equally of the same quality, why would you want to waste resources? That's why we talk about comparative advantage. If Nigeria does not have comparative advantage in manufacturing the meters, or they cannot draw the manufacturers into Nigeria to invest locally, like foreign direct investors, why waste resources? Why don't you import them? So for me, to produce locally or to import is not a key issue. The important thing is how can we get these meters in the cheapest possible manner into the country, and also in the best quality that we can get them. That's what matters. So however it can be done to ensure they arrive at very good prices, very good quality, and effectively distributed to all consumers, for me, that's what matters. If the whole 7 million meters can be produced, let's say, in Russia or in China or in Turkey, for example, then the government can use their power and muscle to engage the producers, get into some agreement with them in terms of timelines, quality, deadlines, and so on, and get them produced. And I believe that that's why they are doing this metering initiative, to deduct money and get ready with the funds before they can make commitments in terms of the metering productions and so on. So I wish them luck. But I think that we have to apply proper economic thinking in doing this, not just national pride that the meters must produce locally. It doesn't matter. As long as quality meters are produced and supplied to end users in Nigeria in the most efficient and most affordable manner.
All right, away from the power sector, let's get into debt servicing right now. The Minister of Finance, Wale Edun, has announced that Nigeria's debt revenue to debt ratio has improved, dropping from 97% to 68% in the year 2024. Now, there are different factors that have contributed to this improvement. What's your reaction to this development?
Okay, thank you, Blessing. I saw that news too, but I want to make a small correction, just my own contribution to the media segment of Nigeria. I'm also one of those who promote financial and economic training for media practitioners. And if SOUQ News can sponsor one and involve me, I don't mind getting involved, even if it's pro bono. It's actually debt service to revenue ratio, not the other way around, revenue to debt service. It's debt service to revenue ratio. That is, out of the whole revenue Nigeria collects, how much, what percentage do we spend in servicing our debt? That is, putting debt service amount, let's say 80 million, over the total revenue that we collect, let's say 100 million. So you now say that the debt service to revenue ratio is 80%, meaning that out of every 100 naira revenue that we collect in Nigeria, we spend 80 naira to service our debt. So we find that in Nigeria, our debt service to revenue ratio has been going up in the recent past, in the past few years. In fact, up to almost 96% some months ago. That is where you can interpret that if Nigeria collects 100 naira in a whole year. I don't know if you can hear me. My network seems to be very weak. Am I coming across clearly enough, please? Okay. So you can interpret that if Nigeria collects, let's say, 100 naira in a year, we spend 96 naira in servicing our debt, and now have only 4 naira for our recurrent and capital expenditure as a country. So meaning that as long as that 4 naira cannot solve your problem, you have to keep borrowing to run your budget. And that's also why we have been running heavily deficit budget in the past few years. So when we hear the news that debt service to revenue ratio is coming down, it means that we're having a bigger space now. After we service our debt from our revenue, we have a bigger space to be able to run our budget, even though it may not be enough. Today we're running budgets running towards 30 trillion, when our revenue has not yet comfortably crossed 10 trillion. That's why we're still very much in debt. But at least it's good news that our debt service to revenue ratio is coming down, giving more room for both recurrent and, very importantly, capital expenditure of government. Even though the factors that are causing this decline in this ratio are also the same factors hurting the economy. Naira depreciation and the subsidy removal, which was rather very ad hoc and sudden. Okay.
Now, talking about debt service revenue ratio, I would like you to give us a picture of what the international standard is when it comes to that, and also looking at that of Nigeria being at 68%. Would you consider that to be healthy given the circumstances that we are in and the state of the economy?
Debt service to revenue ratio, does not have any particular standard or figure for any country. But it's important to say that the higher the ratio is, the much worse, the more terrible for a country. Every country will want to achieve a zero debt service to revenue, even though it's impossible. Even America is owing a whole lot. But the point is that what is the revenue generating power of your economy compared to the size of your economy? If you are amassing debt, like America's debt has been climbing hugely in the past years too. So it's not sinful for nations to borrow or to amass debt in trying to run their budget. But what is sinful is to keep increasing your borrowing when your economy is not producing enough revenue for you to pay your debt and run your recurrent and the capital expenditure, for the country. Nigeria's main problem is that we claim to have a very big economy. Before now, the biggest economy in Africa at above $400 billion, even though the recent developments of our Naira devaluation and so on, or dollar strengthening against Naira, has brought us down to about number 4 in Africa. Let me leave that for now. So you find that we have a big economy that is not producing commensurate amount of revenue, either because of inefficiencies or redundancies or even corruption in the whole process. So if your economy is not growing in terms of the amount of revenue that it produces, meanwhile you are borrowing and borrowing such that your debt service requirement or budget every year is going up, then the country is running into becoming very broke, illiquid, and ultimately insolvent. They are two different things. So the higher your debt service to revenue ratio is, the more illiquid you are becoming. You can't even solve your present problems. While as your debt mount over time too, compared to the size of your GDP and other factors, you can also become insolvent as a nation, such that you can become like Greece, that has struggled over the years to meet their debt obligations. Nigeria had also got there in the past, but thank God for Konji well under Baba Obasanjo's government, where we were able to negotiate debt forgiveness. But the way we have been ramping up these debts over time again, compared to the slow nature of our economic growth and revenue drive, we are also approaching that point of illiquidity and insolvency. So it's important to note that you lower a country's debt service to GDP, debt service to revenue ratio, the better. Also the same thing, when you talk about the debt volume to GDP ratio. But they test different things. One is more about liquidity test. The other one is more about solvency test. So debt service, the amount you use to service your debt, compared to the amount of revenue you generate in a year, debt service to revenue ratio must be as low as possible, hopefully below 40%, for a country to be able to drive its annual budget, fiscal spend of the economy, for a country to be able to maximize its revenue in trying to generate growth, to generate infrastructure that will boost the productive capacity of that economy. So it's good news for Nigeria that this debt service to revenue ratio has dropped from 96%, which is a very horrible position, now to 68%, which, by the way, needs to go much further down. But what has happened here, I see, is that the ways and means financing done by the previous central bank, which was, by the way, a very unforgivable offense, has now been refinanced. They have been collateralized or securitized by government. That is, government has had to now issue bonds to restructure those ways and means obligations, such that the amount of money we pay every month in those interest-bearing instruments have now been structured over a longer term, thereby bringing down our debt service obligations. However, the size of Nigeria's debt in itself has not come down. We have only rescheduled them over a longer time. But in my place, they say that $1 million Eju is a kind of instrument you use to put water for the dog. And when the water is put inside there, it will remain there until the dog comes to drink it. So the debts are still there for Nigeria to pay. Whether it takes 30 years or 20 or 40 years, it is still our obligation. And the more we borrow, the worse it becomes. May God help us.
Now, in looking at ways to further improve the debt service ratio to revenue of Nigeria, what ways can be explored? Right now, the revenue has increased, perhaps owing to the removal of fuel subsidy, oil revenue coming into the country, and maybe better collection of taxes now. But what needs to improve for Nigeria's revenue to increase? And what needs to be done to reduce the cost of borrowing?
Okay, now government having restructured these debts and giving more time for us to pay them, which has therefore brought down our debt service obligations. That's a good step, by the way. What more can we do on the revenue? You know, when you have to deal with both the denominator and the whatever you call the other one again, the numerator and the denominator. All right. So as you deal with the debt service obligation, bringing it down, you can also work on how to raise your revenue. These two actions will end up pushing further down the debt service to revenue obligation of the country. How do we drive our revenue? Yes, fuel subsidy has been removed, giving government more revenue, but on the flip side, it's hurting people. It has caused stupendous inflation and so much hunger, which people are now planning to protest against. But if the subsidy removal was done in a proper manner, the impact will still have been negative, but not too harsh as it is today. But let's leave that. So that's a step to drive revenue, removing subsidy and freeing up more money for government to spend, if they must be spent in the right way to drive economic growth. And of course, trying to unify the FX rate has also reduced the amount of hemorrhage, the amount of money government wastes in trying to defend the Naira. Let Naira find its value based on the forces of demand and supply driven by import-export dynamics. These two have been done. Then, blessing, like you mentioned, we also have to deal massively with the issue of tax collection, not necessarily increasing taxes everywhere, taxing banks on FX revenue, taxing companies on all kinds of things, overtaxing the economy. When you have, more than 80% of the country not being properly taxed. And the argument also about why should I pay tax when government is busy living, a largest lifestyle in Abuja, a chicken and egg situation. Should we pay tax to enable government provide the services? Or should government show the services that they provide with the little tax that we collect so far to encourage us to pay more tax? So there's a problem with Nigeria's tax collection. The economy is huge. There are huge economic activities going on, several players in the economy, but people are not driven. They are not motivated. They are not encouraged to pay their taxes. And by the way, even when they want to pay these taxes, the system that collects the tax, collect this tax from them, and they don't get rendered to government. So there are leakages everywhere. There are inefficiencies everywhere. So that has to be dealt with. Government today does not have to increase all the stamp duties, all the tariffs, all the things that they're doing right now to just catch up with their spending. They must sit back and look at where do we have loopholes in our revenue collections, from customs to immigration to ports authority and all kinds of other major revenue bodies in the country. Are they properly managed? The monies that are received on behalf of Nigeria, do they get to Nigeria actually? Or do they end up in private pockets? If we don't deal with that and just keep increasing tax ratio or tax rates, we will kill this economy. We will drive away investors, and many actually have been driven away so far. Several companies are leaving the country due to so many disincentives in the economy. Like Donald Trump will say in America, when he reduced the tax for big businesses, more of them came in, and the government of America during his term actually got more revenue, in the country. So we have to look at how to drive revenue, not just by taxing people more, but by ensuring that what is taxed already is, expanded and properly collected and accounted for. And you can see yourself having more revenue with the same level of taxing as it is right now. So that's my view. And beyond that too, let me add that Nigeria should begin to diversify its revenue base and, even foreign exchange earnings. We are sitting on a lot of massive potential, revenue sectors, and yet we are focusing a lot on only oil and gas. While oil and gas sector does not give us more than 10-12% of our GDP, it's giving us more than 80% of our, FX revenue, foreign exchange earnings. That's inefficiency. How do we unlock the potentials in agriculture, in tourism, solid minerals, and so on? That's a way to, triple or multiply your revenue generation in many folds by diversifying away from oil and ensuring that every other sector, education sector, medical services, and so on, tourism, construction, all these sectors are opened up for robust economic activities and therefore revenue generation activities. Thank you.
All right, now let's look at the role of inflation in all this. According to the Minister of Finance, the federal government is targeting between 25 and 20% inflation rate before the end of the year. Now, my question is, how possible is this? And then what will be the role of managing inflation as regards debt service to revenue ratio? What will be the impact of inflation on this as we wrap up?
Now, by the time we are able to improve our revenue generation and reduce our debt service to revenue ratio, you find that government will be under less pressure to run the economy. And the ways and means and all other factors that tend to drive prices up and so on will be better managed. All right? And if we also see government driving foreign exchange revenue coming in bigger quantity, what will happen to our Naira is that Naira will be strengthened. And once Naira is strengthened, in my view, inflation will drop. Because Nigerian inflation, I always say, is more cost pushed than demand pulled. So what it means is that if we're able to bring in more revenue, USD, for example, and Naira begins to trend down towards 1,000 Naira or even 800 Naira to $1, most of this inflation will go away. Because our inflation is driven by cost of, input materials, cost of imported raw materials, and of course, cost of imported finished products, where the country imports nearly everything that we consume in this country. So when we see more revenue, both local and foreign exchange revenue coming to the country to improve our debt service to revenue ratio and so on, you also find that the Naira will be strengthened and the inflationary pressure in the economy will come down. For now, the target to achieve 24% inflation before the end of the year is merely wishful thinking. And of course, based on the level of inflation right now, you might see month-on-month inflation begin to trend down before the year-on-year will now follow due to base effect. All right, so ultimately to drive Nigeria's inflation down, we need to ramp up our foreign exchange earnings. We need to ramp up our local productivity, our agricultural production, so that we don't need to import so many or so much food products. If the farm activities in the middle belt and the rest of the country can be ramped up by chasing away the herdsmen and the bandits or protecting the farmers to go back to the farm. Can you imagine where a tuber of yam that used to be 2,000 Naira a few months ago is now almost 10,000 Naira. So people are no more going to the farm. So the farmers are the new millionaires waiting in this country. If you can protect them to go to the farm, particularly in the north. And if kidnapping and so on can also allow activities go on around the country, we can see prices begin to come down. So security needs to be dealt with, banditry issues and so on. And of course, better local production. When you also solve the energy crisis that we spoke about earlier, you find that productivity will rise and level of importation will come down. That's what you call import substitution. We will produce more of what we consume in this country, import less, and the pressure on Naira will come down, and therefore the cost push-driven inflation will also begin to taper.
Thank you so much, Orji I beg your pardon, Orji Chigozie Udumezue. You know your names are, I like to call all of them because you give wonderful contribution on the show. Thank you so much for being a part of the program today. We're talking about what Nigerian government is doing in the power sector by providing meters, and now we looked at how the debt service ratio to GDP to revenue of Nigeria has improved from 97% to 68%. Thank you for your time with us.
Okay, thanks for inviting me. Always my pleasure. I wish you guys all the best at SOUQ News.
Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.